Let's explore this further. I'm with William Bird from the Media Monitoring Africa. William, thank you so much for coming through. Your recollection of those days, if I can jog your memory a little bit, what is your recollection? How easy was it? How difficult was it for journalists to continue to be on the straight and narrow when there were all these tactics to tarnish the image of apartheid's opponents?
So look, I mean, we forget actually just what an extraordinary country we are, that we have the level of media freedom that we do these days, that we can be on air and we can say what we like, we can write rude things, we can say rude things about the president, past, current, future, whatever we like, you know. And at the time, you couldn't do any of those things. You couldn't talk about the ANC. If you mentioned the ANC, you would be arrested. People would be around your house. They'd be monitoring your actions. You'd be intimidated. You'd be assaulted. You know, it wasn't. It really is important that we remember just what an extraordinarily brutal, awful past we've emerged from. And in that time, the apartheid government used every trick in the book to make sure that they misinform, disinform. People think this thing of fake news is new. Not at all. You know, the apartheid people were past masters at this kind of nonsense. They deliberately used a number of journalists and people at the time to spread a whole lot of misinformation. And certainly, I think some of those issues were aired at the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, and some of them weren't. And now, what we're seeing in South Africa now, I think, is the fact that because we're dealing with the mourning of Winnie Madikizela Mandela, we are witnessing this fact that there's a lot of tension around her and her legacy, and it's a little bit easy to fall for things that people simply don't remember, and in many instances they aren't true.
So within that context, what have you made about the sort of claims that are coming out, in particular about these three journalists, and also about a publication such as the Weekly Mail, which was a publication that was seen as being sympathetic to the ANC at the time?
So I think we need to be clear. There were certain claims made before the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, including the comments about the list of 40 journalists. That's there. The ANC commented on it in their submission. The organisation I represent, we commented on it more than 2 decades ago. So those things were there. We need to accept that certain media professionals worked for and did the dirty deeds for the apartheid government. To then go and say that because the Weekly Mail said negative things and reported negatively in some instances about Winnie is a very, very different sort of idea, though. You know, because you report negatively, to suggest that means that you're a spy. I mean, it's completely ludicrous, to be quite honest. And I think that we need to be very careful. And political parties especially need to be very careful about what kind of language and discourse they use in referring to these issues.
But how helpful is reopening this debate in terms of, you know, coming to the knowledge of the full facts and embracing our past? I've seen some making calls for those, alleged 40 journalists that did the work for Stratcom to come out on their own or be exposed. How important a conversation is it that we should have this, especially given some of the criticism that the media faces to this day, and given, we were all a product of where we come from?
Yeah. So lovely. I think that it's critical that we have really important decisions about and discussions about where our media is and where they've come from, what they did and what they didn't do. You know, this channel that we're on today was nowhere near, it wasn't even an idea and wasn't even a twinkle in the eyes of people when under apartheid. You know, it simply couldn't have been. We now have it, and I think it's important for us to start to say, well, how do we begin to deal with our past? And our media did play a significant role in that, in entrenching and enforcing apartheid. So I think that there's a lot of need and important discussions that need to happen there, and that by and large, to some degree, these start to happen when we talk about media transformation. We talk about making sure that we have greater diversity of voices, more voices from other community, that we make sure that there's proper transformation in the media. This is where the discussions need to be happening. But that against the idea that saying that people that were fighting against apartheid, and let's be clear, the ones in the Weekly Mail were, to suggest that they were somehow doing the bidding of the apartheid government is simply ludicrous.
Does the outrage that we've seen around this particular story suggest to you that the work that the Truth and Reconciliation Commission did specifically around the media did not perhaps reveal all and perhaps, let everyone be settled with our past?
So I think the TRC is a very difficult thing to deal with because to varying degrees it was successful and less successful. And certainly in relation to the media, you'll be aware that some media made submissions and some didn't. Some people went before it and some didn't. There's been some books written about the unfinished business of the TRC. It's not like even if we discuss these things, we're going to get away from our past. The reality is that we are product, as you said earlier, of our history, and that a lot of these conversations about racism, about the role that media played under apartheid, we still need to have a lot of those conversations. And I think that there's a lot of value to be gained from doing those things. But against that is the idea that saying that certain people involved in those were apartheid spies, when there's no evidence or no basis for it. These things have real consequences. So some of the people that have been identified have had death threats as a result of this. That's completely unacceptable in a democracy. We can't tolerate a situation where because someone gets identified in these things, they suddenly are experiencing death threats, especially when there's absolutely no evidence for it.
So let me ask you directly then, William. Would you support a call for us to have some kind of inquiry into the specific allegation that Stratcom, the apartheid-era strategic communications of the state security that specialized in tarnishing the image of opponents, had some 40 journalists that worked with them, and specifically that this included the individuals mentioned in these reports?
So I think that we need to be saying, should we be uncovering more about our past and naming and identifying those that did play a role? Yes, but then we need to be very, very careful about how we do that. Bear in mind that these people specialized in misinformation. The idea that they can then go ahead and sow dissent now is an incredibly wonderful idea to them. So we can't just rely on the apartheid thieves. Just because they live in the past doesn't mean that we can think that they're going to tell the truth. So I think that what we need to do is say we need to get evidence about who these people were, what role they played, and then I don't think that once that's present that we shouldn't be exposing them. But I think to be going on the basis of saying, well, these people wrote critical articles of Winnie suggests that they necessarily part of Stratcom is just crazy. So
let me ask another question then. I suppose in analyzing the coverage that Winnie Madikizela-Mandela was subjected to over the decades, is there something for the media to reflect on? Because a lot of people have actually said that it's only now that she's late, that, it's sort of, she's being vindicated in the media, and all these people that are coming out to say that actually, she was being tarnished, her image was being tarnished. What do you make of that particular argument? So
I think that there's a lot of validity to that, I think that what we've seen over the last week or so is that her legacy is really difficult. It's really complicated. We're learning a whole range of new things that people didn't know about. The documentary exposed a litany of things that people simply weren't aware of, a whole range of and different sides. What we do know about our media is that as a trend of representing female politicians and women in general, there's a bias, So do our media have a case to answer for? Yes, they do. But is that somehow linked to a Stratcom strategy to undermine our democracy? No, I don't think that is the case. We need to be identifying those that played a role in apartheid, and then we need to be saying, well, what role should our media be playing now in a democracy, and how do we take our democracy forward? How do we make sure that we have more women's voices in media, that they talk about these things? The point that you had the poet on one of the earlier broadcasts talking about it, we're very easy to forgive men their faults and their frailties, but we don't seem to be very easy to forgive women the same thing. And there is a bias there. It's the nature of existing in a patriarchal society.
So just talk to me again about the death threats that you're saying some of these individuals whose names are, being thrown out there have received? How concerned are you, and are we at a point at which, I mean, of course, all of this is happening in a context of social media where, communication is direct and immediate and can be quite ruthless. Are we at a point where some of these individuals should be looking at getting some kind of protection from the state?
What we've seen over the last couple of years is a significant increase in threats and attacks on our journalists, and that has to worry everyone. People think, well, they're just journalists, but actually they're the ones at the front line that report our democracy to us, and had it not been for our journalists, we wouldn't have known many of the things we know today. So it's really important that people who threaten the lives of journalists are held accountable. So when people threaten the lives of journalists now, we need to be saying these are very, very serious allegations, because it encourages a self-censorship. It encourages people to not maybe report those kinds of things. So the fact that they are being smeared in this way, the real questions we need to be asking is who's making these allegations, and what do they have to gain by making the allegations against the people that are being identified? And what is their purpose in making these kinds of allegations? And that's, I think, where we can start to take the conversation forward.
But surely, William, you must be just a little bit curious about who are these 40 journalists. I've seen this question posed all over the place. Here's Vic McPherson, who was director at Stratcom, says we had 40 journalists that worked with us to ensure that these stories are planted in the media. If the Truth and Reconciliation Commission did not answer those particular questions, and if this issue about 40 journalists is something that's relatively new, not necessarily new as in it's something we didn't know, but in comparison to the work of the TRC, surely you must be curious yourself to say, who are these people?
Well, of course I am. I mean, I think that all of us are, and they should be exposed, those people. But I think that in all honesty, it was a lot more than 40 journalists, and maybe Stratcom was paying just those 40 to do particular things. And if we can find out who they were, and there's evidence as to who they were and how they were paid, then I think that they should be exposed. Against that, you need to be saying, well, who are these people that are revealing this kind of information to us, and on what basis are they doing it? You can't think that just because we're now in a democracy that suddenly they're going to feel nice and that they should somehow tell the truth. So we need evidence on which to base those things, because otherwise we end up in the situation where we are today, where you've got people that are not spies being identified as spies. And that's completely inappropriate and ludicrous, and it doesn't take us forward. It doesn't help us making these kinds of baseless allegations when we need to actually say, well, who were these people, and on what basis were they doing the work for Stratcom?
My final question to you, to what extent are these claims that are being made now going to muddy the waters in as far as something that you touched on a bit earlier on, the debate around media transformation in South Africa in the current context now?
I don't think that they hamper them, and certainly they're not antithetical at all. We need to continue to push around issues of media transformation, and at the same time we need to make sure that media have difficult conversations about the role that they played. And if part of that is about saying we need to identify X and Y and Z, a number of journalists, then we need to do so. I guess what we need to be very careful of is that in seeking to expose these people, we don't go on some kind of a witch hunt. We need to exercise a lot of caution in the way that we do this, particularly because the people that are doing these things, we need to be wondering about what their motivations are for doing it at this point in time, at this particular juncture where we are in South Africa.